How can a man be accused of murder when every piece of evidence condemns him, yet the victim may not be dead at all? And what will Sherlock Holmes uncover when he looks beyond the truth everyone else accepts? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight's tale is The Adventure of the Norwood Builder by Arthur Conan Doyle, a classic tale reimagined and retold for the modern age.
From Holmes's perspective, London had lost its edge. He said it casually, almost lazily, as if commenting on the weather, that the city no longer held any real fascination now that Professor Moriarty was gone. The great adversary was dead, and with him had vanished the hidden tension that once pulsed beneath London's streets. I pushed back, of course. Ordinary people, I said, would hardly mourn the absence of a criminal mastermind. Holmes only smiled. He leaned away from the breakfast table, the chair legs scraping softly across the floor, amused by my objection. Society, he admitted, was unquestionably safer. Streets were calmer, newspapers duller. The only true casualty, he joked, was the specialist without work, the man whose entire craft depended on monsters worthy of his mind. When Moriarty lived, Holmes explained, every morning paper felt like a coded message, a trivial robbery here, a senseless assault there, incidents so small they barely deserved a headline. Yet to Holmes they were tremors, subtle vibrations along the edge of an invisible web, and where the web moved, the spider was never far from the center. To anyone else, these crimes were random, meaningless, but Holmes saw patterns where others saw noise. He understood how chaos could be shaped into order by a single malignant intelligence. London in those days was unrivaled, a living laboratory for the scientific study of crime at its highest level. No city in Europe had offered such complexity, such possibility. Now, nothing. Holmes shrugged, dismissing the quiet world he himself had helped create. At that point in time, he had been back for several months. At his urging, I had abandoned my medical practice and returned to Baker Street, resuming our old life as if no years had passed at all. My small practice in Kensington had been sold quickly, almost suspiciously so, to a young doctor named Werner, who paid far more than I had dared to request. The reason for his generosity remained a mystery to me for years. Only later did I learn the truth. Werner was distantly related to Holmes, and the money, as always, had come from my friend. Those months beside Holmes were far from quiet, despite his later insistence that nothing of note had occurred. When I look back through my private notes now, I see how misleading that claim truly was. That same stretch of time held the strange business surrounding the missing documents of former President Murillo, and the harrowing incident aboard the Dutch steamship Friesland, an affair that came dangerously close to ending both our lives. Holmes, however, had always recoiled from public recognition. Praise unsettled him. Fame bored him. He demanded, quite forcefully, that I record nothing of his methods, his reasoning, or his victories. For years that silence bound my pen. Only recently had he lifted the restriction, allowing these accounts to finally surface. That morning, after making his half-joking lament about the dullness of modern crime, Holmes reclined in his chair and unfolded the newspaper with deliberate calm. The room was peaceful, too peaceful. Then the bell rang. Not a polite summons, a violent one. The sound slammed through the flat, followed instantly by a heavy pounding on the front door, raw, desperate, frantic. Before either of us could rise, the door flew open. Footsteps thundered across the hall, raced up the stairs, and an instant later a stranger burst into the room, as if fleeing something unseen. He was young, deathly pale. His hair was unkempt, his clothes disordered, his chest heaving as though he had run for his life. His eyes darted between Holmes and me, wide with panic, until he seemed to realize, under our steady scrutiny, that an apology was owed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes," he blurted out. "You must forgive me. I'm not myself. I'm nearly out of my mind." He swallowed hard, then forced the words out. "My name is John Hector MacFarlane." He spoke it as though the name alone should justify the chaos of his arrival, as though it carried weight, explanation, perhaps even doom. But Holmes's expression did not change. To him, the name meant nothing. Holmes calmly reached for his cigarette case and slid it across the table. "Please," he said evenly, "help yourself. Judging by your condition, my colleague Dr. Watson would insist on something to steady the nerves. The heat has been oppressive these past days." His voice never rose, never hurried. "Now," Holmes continued, gesturing toward a chair, "when you feel able, sit down, take your time, and tell us, slowly and clearly, who you are and why you have come to see me." The young man hesitated, trembling slightly before obeying. And in that pause, heavy, fragile, electric, I sensed that whatever he was about to say would shatter the calm of Baker Street once again. "You spoke your name as though I should already know it," Holmes said calmly. "I don't, at least not personally. All I can tell you is this: you are unmarried, you practice law, you belong to the Freemasons, you suffer from asthma, and beyond that you are a stranger to me." I had watched Holmes closely as he spoke. His conclusions were obvious once you knew how to look. Creased clothing worn by a man who worked long hours, a thick bundle of legal documents clutched too tightly, a symbolic charm hanging from a watch chain, and the shallow, uneven breathing of someone whose lungs betrayed him under stress. To me, the deductions were routine. To our visitor, they were impossible. He stared at Holmes as though the floor had vanished beneath his feet. "Yes," he said hoarsely, "every word of it is true. But there is more, much more. At this moment, I am the most miserable man in all of London." He leaned forward, desperation spilling into his voice. "For God's sake, Mr. Holmes, don't turn me away. If the police arrive before I finish my account, make them wait. Just give me time to tell you everything. I swear to you, I could face a prison cell without fear if I knew you were working to prove my innocence." Holmes's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Arrest you?" he said. "That is, how shall I put it, remarkably interesting. And what crime precisely do you expect to be arrested for?" The young man swallowed hard. "For the murder of Mr. Jonas Oldacre of Lower Norwood." Holmes's face shifted, not to shock, but to something far more complex. Sympathy, certainly, yet beneath it, unmistakably, was a spark of interest, even satisfaction. "Well now," Holmes murmured, "that is quite extraordinary. Only moments ago at breakfast I was lamenting to Dr. Watson that truly dramatic cases had vanished from the newspapers." The visitor's hand trembled as he reached forward and seized the newspaper still resting across Holmes's knee. "If you had opened it, sir," he said urgently, "you would have known at once why I came here today. My name, my ruin, it feels as though it's already on every tongue in the city." He flipped the paper open, exposing the center page. "Here," he said, "if you permit me, I'll read it aloud. Listen carefully, Mr. Holmes." His finger traced the bold print at the top of the page. The headline reads, "Mysterious Affair at Lower Norwood." His voice faltered. And in that instant, I knew we were standing at the threshold of a case that would drag secrets into the light, and possibly condemn an innocent man before the truth could catch its breath. Disappearance of a prominent builder, suspicions of murder and arson, a crucial lead identified. His voice cracked as he recited the words. "That lead," he said, clutching the paper as if it might burn him, is already being followed, Mr. Holmes, and I know exactly where it points. To me. I was followed from London Bridge Station. I felt it the entire way. They're waiting now, just waiting for the warrant." His hands twisted together, knuckles white. "It will destroy my mother," he whispered. "It will break her heart." The chair creaked as he rocked back and forth, overcome by fear. I studied him carefully. This was the man the city was preparing to brand a murderer. He didn't look like one. Fair-haired and well-groomed in a faded sort of elegance, he had the anxious blue eyes of someone unused to confrontation. His face was clean-shaven, almost boyish, with a mouth that betrayed sensitivity rather than cruelty. I would have placed him at no more than 27. His clothing was neat, restrained, the unmistakable bearing of a gentleman. From the pocket of his light summer coat, a thick stack of legal documents spilled outward, silently confirming his profession. Holmes broke the silence. "Then we must make use of what little time remains," he said evenly. "Watson, be so good as to read the article aloud." I took the paper from our client's trembling hands. Beneath the bold, accusatory headlines lay the body of the report, a narrative carefully worded to alarm without accusing outright. I read, "Late last night, or in the early hours of this morning, an incident occurred at Lower Norwood which authorities fear may point to a grave crime. Mr. Jonas Oldacre, a long-established resident of the district, has been missing since the night before. For many years, Mr. Oldacre conducted his business as a builder and contractor, and was widely known throughout the area. Mr. Oldacre, aged 52, unmarried, resided alone at Deep Dean House, located near the Sydenham end of the road bearing that name. He was regarded as a man of peculiar habits, withdrawn, secretive, and prone to solitude." As I read on, the room seemed to grow smaller. Each word tightened the invisible noose around the young man seated before us, and Holmes, silent, motionless, listened as though every sentence were another piece sliding perfectly into place. For years, the article explained, Oldacre had quietly stepped away from active work. The business had run itself, accumulating wealth while its owner withdrew further from public view. Only a modest timber yard remained behind the house, a relic of the enterprise that had once defined him. That yard became the night's focal point. Shortly before midnight, an alarm was raised. One of the timber stacks was ablaze. Fire engines arrived quickly, but speed proved useless. The wood was bone dry, feeding the flames with terrifying enthusiasm. The fire raged uncontrollably until the entire stack collapsed into embers. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a tragic accident, unfortunate, dramatic, but ordinary. Then the questions began. Observers noted something unsettling. The owner of the property was nowhere to be seen. As the fire died down, concern turned into suspicion. A search of the house followed, and what was discovered inside shifted the nature of the incident entirely. Oldacre's bedroom told a disturbing story. The bed had not been slept in. A heavy safe stood open, its contents disturbed. Important documents lay scattered across the floor, as if rifled through in haste or fury. And then there were the marks, subtle, easily missed, but impossible to ignore once seen. Small traces of blood, enough to suggest violence, enough to suggest resistance. An oak walking stick lay nearby. Its handle was stained. The paper continued, its tone tightening with each sentence. Investigators had learned that Mr. Jonas Oldacre had received a late-night visitor in his bedroom on the very evening of the fire. The walking stick, now entered into evidence, had been positively identified as belonging to that visitor. The name followed. A young solicitor from London, John Hector McFarlane, junior partner at Graham and McFarlane of Gresham Buildings. As I finished reading, silence settled heavily over the room. Every detail pointed in one direction, Every line of print pushed the same conclusion. The city had already chosen its suspect, and the man sitting before us, pale, trembling, condemned by ink and rumor, knew it. Holmes remained motionless, his eyes fixed not on the article at all, but on McFarlane himself, as if the truth were not in the article at all, but waiting to reveal itself in the man's fear. The article left little room for doubt. According to the authorities, they now possessed evidence strong enough to establish motive. The implication was clear. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. The paper promised revelations ahead, the kind that would grip the city and refuse to let go. Then came the final lines, a late update, hot off the press. As the report rushed towards its conclusion, the tone sharpened into something colder, more decisive. It was being whispered, no, circulated, that John Hector McFarlane had already been taken into custody. At the very least, a warrant for his arrest had been issued. The machinery of justice had begun to turn. And still, the story grew darker. Investigators at Norwood had uncovered further details described as deeply troubling. Beyond the signs of violence inside the builder's bedroom, new discoveries had emerged. The French windows, opening directly onto the garden, had been found wide open during the search. On the ground outside, there were marks in the soil, long, uneven grooves, as though something heavy had been dragged away from the house, dragged toward the timber yard, toward the fire. Most disturbing of all, the ashes themselves had yielded a terrible suggestion. Among the blackened remains of the burned wood, fragments had been found, charred remnants that investigators believed could only be human. The theory advanced by the police was both simple and horrifying. Jonas Oldacre, they claimed, had been attacked in his own bedroom, struck down with a blunt instrument, his papers searched, his possessions violated, his lifeless body then hauled across the garden and thrown onto the timber stack, which was deliberately set ablaze to erase all evidence of the crime. A perfect ending, a crime reduced to smoke. Responsibility for the case, the article concluded, had been entrusted to Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, a man praised for his experience, determination, and relentless pursuit of every available clue. When I lowered the paper, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. The narrative was complete, the conclusion already written. In the eyes of the public and the police, John Hector McFarlane was no longer a suspect. He was a murderer. Holmes finally moved. He folded his hands, his expression unreadable, and studied the young man seated across from him, not as a criminal, not as a victim, but as a puzzle still unsolved. And in that quiet moment I sensed that the story printed in the newspapers was not the truth, but merely the illusion everyone was too eager to believe. Holmes leaned back, eyes closed, fingertips pressed together in that signature pose, absorbing every word of the young man's frantic story. "This case," he said slowly, his voice almost lazy, "does possess certain intriguing points. But perhaps, Mr. McFarlane, you might explain something for me first. How is it that you remain at liberty? By all accounts, the evidence against you seems overwhelming." McFarlane's hands twitched in the air, his pale face etched with dread. "I live with my parents at Torrington Lodge, Blackheath. Last night I had to meet Mr. Jonas Oldacre for business and stayed in a hotel in Norwood afterward. I knew nothing of this, of what you've just read, until I opened the paper on the train. I understood immediately the danger I was in and hurried straight to you. I was certain they would arrest me, either at my office or at home. A man followed me from London Bridge Station, I swear it, and I have no doubt— Great heavens, what is that?" Before he could finish, the bell clanged sharply, heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, and then in the doorway appeared a familiar figure, Inspector Lestrade. Over his shoulder I glimpsed one or two uniformed officers waiting outside. "Mr. John Hector MacFarlane?" Lestrade's voice cut through the tension like steel. McFarland rose slowly, face ashen, as though the floor beneath him had vanished. "I arrest you for the willful murder of Mr. Jonas Oldacre of Lower Norwood," Lestrade declared. Despair drained McFarland's strength. He sank back into his chair, crushed, as if the weight of accusation alone could extinguish life. Holmes, calm and measured, lifted a hand. "One moment, Inspector. Half an hour more or less cannot alter your course, but this gentleman was on the verge of giving us a full account of this most fascinating affair, which may well assist in clarifying the situation." Lestrade's jaw tightened, his expression hard. "I see no reason why this cannot be resolved," he said tersely. "Very well," Holmes replied, with the faintest trace of amusement. "With your permission, I should be most interested to hear his account." And in that charged silence the stage was set. The accused, the detective, and the relentless machinery of the law, all poised on the edge of revelation. "Well, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began, his tone grudging but respectful, "it's hard to refuse you anything. You've assisted the force a time or two before, and Scotland Yard owes you that much. Still, I must remain with my prisoner, and I warn him, anything he says can and will be used as evidence." "I ask nothing else," McFarland earnestly replied. "I only wish you to hear the absolute truth." Lestrade checked his watch. "You have 30 minutes, he granted. McFarland drew a steadying breath. "I must begin at the start," he said. "I did not know Mr. Jonas Oldacre personally. His name was familiar because my parents had known him long ago, but their lives drifted apart. I was astonished yesterday, around 3 in the afternoon, when he walked into my office in the city. I was more astonished still when he explained why he had come. He carried several sheets of a notebook, all scrawled with his handwriting. He laid them carefully on my desk. 'Here is my will,' he said in that sharp, precise voice. 'I want you, Mr. McFarlane, to put this into proper legal form. I will remain here while you do so.' I set to work, copying the document, and you can imagine my disbelief when I realized, save for a few small reservations, he had left everything to me, every penny. He was a peculiar little man, sharp-eyed, with white eyelashes that gave him an almost ferret-like appearance. And yet, when I looked up, those keen gray eyes held a spark of amusement, as though he delighted in my astonishment. I could scarcely believe what I was reading, but he explained patiently. He was a bachelor with hardly any living relatives. He had known my parents in his youth, and he had always heard of me as an honest, deserving young man. He trusted his fortune to me. Of course, I could only stammer my thanks. The will was finalized, signed, and witnessed by my clerk. 'These blue sheets,' he said, gesturing to the papers in front of him, 'are the finished document, and these slips are merely the rough draft, as I explained earlier.' Mr. Jonas Oldacre explained that there were numerous documents, building leases, title deeds, mortgages, scrip, and other papers that I needed to see and understand. He insisted that his mind would not be at ease until everything was in order. 'Come to my house in Norwood tonight and bring the will with you. We'll settle it all together. But my boy,' he added, leaning forward with a conspiratorial gleam in his sharp eyes, 'not a word to your parents until it's done. We'll keep it a little surprise for them.' His insistence was firm, almost playful, yet unmistakably serious. I promised, knowing I could not refuse. After all, he was my benefactor, and every fiber of my being wanted to fulfill his wishes precisely. I sent a brief telegram home, explaining that I had pressing business and could not say when I would return. Oldacre had suggested supper at 9, though I discovered, with some difficulty, that his house was not easy to find. By the time I arrived, it was nearly 9:30. Holmes interjected, as always, precise in detail. "One moment. Who opened the door?" "A middle-aged woman, his housekeeper, I presume," I replied. "And she mentioned your name?" "Exactly." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray continue." Macfarlane wiped his damp brow with a handkerchief, then went on, his voice tightening as he recounted the night. "The housekeeper led me into a modest sitting-room, where a simple supper was waiting. Afterward, Mr. Oldacre brought me into his bedroom. There stood heavy safe, an imposing presence in the small room. He opened it and pulled out a mass of papers. Together we went through each one, discussing their significance, checking details and arranging everything to his satisfaction. The weight of responsibility pressed on me, yet I was determined to see it done correctly, as he wished. It was between 11 and midnight when we finally finished. Oldacre reminded me in his precise, deliberate way not to disturb the housekeeper. Then, with a careful glance around the room, he led me to his French window, which had remained open all this time, and showed me out. Holmes's voice cut through the story. "Was the blind down?" "I can't be certain, but I think it was only half drawn. Yes, I remember now that he lifted it to swing the window open. I could not find my walking stick, and he said, 'Never mind, my boy, I hope to see much of you in the future, and I shall keep your stick until you return to claim it.' I left him there, the safe still open, papers neatly bundled on the table, and stepped into the night. It was too late to return to Blackheath, so I stayed at the Annerley Arms. I slept without incident, entirely unaware of the nightmare that would unfold the next morning." Lestrade's eyebrows had risen more than once during this astonishing narrative. "Anything further you wish to ask, Mr. Holmes?" he finally said. Holmes shook his head. "Not until I have been to Blackheath." Lestrade's brow furrowed. "You mean Norwood, of course." "Oh, yes, certainly," Holmes replied, that enigmatic smile tugging at the corners of his lips. By now Lestrade knew better to underestimate him. Holmes's mind could slice through barriers that the rest of us could only perceive as walls. I saw Lestrade glance at my companion with a mixture of frustration and awe. "I should like a word with you shortly, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, a note of curiosity in his tone. Turning to Macfarlane, he continued, "Two of my constables are waiting at the door. A four-wheeler is ready to take you away." The young man rose, casting one last pleading glance towards us. Then, shoulders heavy with despair, he followed the officers out of the room and into the cab. Lestrade lingered behind. Holmes, meanwhile, had picked up the pages of the rough draft, the will, and was studying them with an intensity that made his usual calm seem almost electric. Every line, every scribble seemed to capture his full attention, as though the secrets of the night lay hidden in those simple sheets of paper. Holmes pushed the folded pages toward Lestrade, his eyes gleaming with that familiar intensity. "There are some curious points about this document, Inspector," he said quietly. Lestrade peered at the pages, frowning. "I can make out the first few lines, some passages in the middle of the second page, and a few words at the end," he admitted. "Everything else is messy, scribbled, barely legible, and in 3 places I cannot read a word." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And what do you make of that?" "Well, what do you make of it?" Lestrade shot back, skepticism in his tone. "That it was written on a train. The clear writing marks the stations. The messy lines indicate movement. The parts almost impossible to read? Those were sections where the pen passed over bumps or jolts. A scientific handwriting expert could deduce instantly this was done on a suburban line. Only near a major city could the stops and starts occur with such frequency." Lestrade let out a laugh, half exasperated, half incredulous. "You're too much for me when you start your theories, Holmes. How does this help the case?" Holmes's eyes never left the papers. "It confirms McFarlane's story. Oldacre indeed prepared the will during his journey yesterday. Curious, isn't it, to draft so significant a document in such a haphazard way? It implies he did not think it would ever have practical effect. A man drawing up a will he did not intend to execute might very well scribble it carelessly, unconcerned with form or clarity." Lestrade's brow knit. "Or," he said, lowering his voice, "he drew his own death warrant at the same time." "Oh?" He tilted his head, almost amused. "You think so? Don't you?" "Quite possible," Holmes admitted, his tone calm but measured. "Yet I am not convinced the case is clear. There are too many shadows here, too many questions unanswered, but we are beginning to see the outlines of the truth." "Not clear?" Lestrade snapped, his voice rising with impatience. "Here is a young man who suddenly learns that should an older gentleman die, he stands to inherit a fortune. What does he do? He keeps his counsel, says nothing to anyone, and schemes to visit the client that very night under some pretext. He waits until the only other person in the house is asleep. Then, alone in the man's room, he strikes. He murders him, drags the body to the woodpile, sets it ablaze, and slips away to a nearby hotel. The blood in the room and on the stick was slight, so he imagined the crime bloodless. He expected the fire to erase every trace, but for some reason something inevitably pointed to him. It's all perfectly obvious." Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed, voice calm and deliberate. "It strikes me, my good Lestrade, as being just a trifle too obvious." Lestrade's eyebrows shot up. "You excel in deduction, Inspector, but imagination is another matter. Consider, if you were this young man, would you commit your crime the very night the will was made? Would you not see the danger in linking these two events so closely? Would you choose a time when your presence in the house was known, when a servant had admitted you? And finally," Holmes added, a thin smile touching his lips, "would you go to the lengths of hiding the body so carefully, yet leave behind your own walking stick as a calling card? Confess, Lestrade, it seems very unlikely, does it not?" Lestrade pressed his lips together. "As for the stick, Holmes, you know as well as I do that a flustered criminal often makes mistakes a calm man would avoid. He probably feared returning to the room. Now tell me, give me another theory that fits the facts." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I can offer half a dozen easily. Here, for example, is one that is not only possible, but highly probable, and I make it a free gift for your consideration." Holmes leaned forward, eyes glinting with that familiar spark of certainty. "The scenario is simple," he said. "Oldacre shows documents of obvious value. The blinds are only half drawn. A tramp sees them through the window. Exit the solicitor, enter the tramp. He notices the stick, strikes Oldacre down, and leaves, burning the body to cover his crime." Lestrade's voice was skeptical. "And why should the tramp burn the body?" Holmes shrugged. "For the same reason McFarlane, or any man might, to hide evidence." "Surely," Lestrade pressed, "the tramp would take something valuable." "Not in this case," Holmes replied smoothly. "The papers could not be negotiated. He simply had no use for them. And perhaps, as I said, he wished only to conceal that a murder had occurred at all." Lestrade shook his head, the certainty that had accompanied him before now tinged with doubt. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said finally, "you may hunt for your tramp. In the meantime we will hold on to our man. Time alone will show which of us is right. Consider this, though. None of the papers were removed, and McFarlane, the prisoner, had no reason to remove them anyway. As heir at law they would come to him automatically." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest at that remark. I do not deny that the evidence may seem to support your theory. I only point out that other explanations remain possible. As you say, the future will decide. Good morning. I dare say before long I shall pay a visit to Norwood and see how matters progress." With that, the detective departed, leaving the room charged with thought. MacFarlane rose, gathering himself, and prepared for the day's work with the air of a man ready for a demanding but engaging task. "My first move, Watson," Holmes said briskly, slipping into his frock-coat, "must be towards Blackheath." "And why not Norwood?" I asked. Holmes straightened his coat and spoke with that measured calm that always hid the storm of thought behind it. "Watson, in this case we have two remarkable incidents occurring in close succession. The police are fixated on the second, the actual crime, because it is visible, tangible. But the logical approach is to examine the first, the curious will, drawn up so suddenly, leaving the fortune to such an unexpected heir. Understanding that may illuminate everything that followed. No, my dear fellow, you cannot assist me. There is no danger in my errand, otherwise I would not move without you. I trust that when I return this evening I can report that some good has been done for this unfortunate young man who has placed himself entirely in my hands." Hours later, when Holmes finally returned, his face bore the toll of the day, haggard, anxious, far from the confident spark with which he had set out. For a while he drew the bow across the violin strings, letting the notes soothe his restless mind. But at last he flung the instrument aside and launched into a full account of his day's misadventures.
"All is going awry, Watson," he said grimly. "I maintained a bold front before Lestrade, but upon my soul I fear he may be on the right track while we are entirely mistaken. Every instinct I possess points one way, but all the facts scream another. I suspect that British juries are not yet wise enough to favor deduction over the obvious evidence, even when that evidence is misleading." "Did you go to Blackheath?" I asked. "Yes, Watson, I went," he said, pacing the room. "I quickly discovered that the late Mr. Oldacre was a thoroughly unpleasant man. MacFarlane's father was away, searching for his son. The mother, a small blue-eyed woman, trembled with a mix of fear and indignation. Naturally, she would not acknowledge the possibility of her son's guilt, yet she showed no surprise or regret over Oldacre's fate. A curious combination of denial and indifference, which I suspect conceals much. On the contrary, the mother spoke of Oldacre with such venom that she unwittingly strengthened the police's case. If her son had absorbed even a fraction of that bitterness, it could easily have fueled hatred, or worse, violence. "He was more like a malignant, cunning ape than a human being," she spat, her hands trembling. "He always was, ever since he was a young man." "You knew him back then?" I asked. "Yes, well enough," she said, her voice hardening. "He was once a suitor of mine. Thank heaven I had the sense to turn away and marry a better, if poorer, man. I was engaged to him when I learned a dreadful story. He had turned a cat loose in an aviary. The cruelty horrified me. I could not endure it. I refused him utterly." She rifled through a bureau and pulled out a photograph of herself, cruelly defaced and slashed with a knife. "She sent this to me," she said, her eyes flashing, "on my wedding day, with his curse upon it." I offered a quiet remark. "Well, at least he must have forgiven you now, leaving all his property to your son." "Forgiven?" she exclaimed, her voice ringing with righteous anger. "Neither my son nor I want a penny from Jonas Oldacre, dead or alive. There is a God in heaven, Mr. Holmes, and he will make it known in his time that my son's hands are innocent of that man's blood." Holmes pressed on. He tried a few leads, but found nothing that supported his working hypothesis, and several points even seemed to contradict it. Frustrated, he abandoned them and set off for Norwood.
Deepdean House was a modern villa of harsh red brick, standing back from the road in its own grounds, a laurel-clumped lawn stretching before it. To the right, some distance back, lay the timber yard, the scene of the fire. Holmes sketched a rough plan in his notebook, marking the window to the left, the one that opened into Oldacre's room. "You can see it all from the road," Holmes said, surveying the scene with his sharp eyes. "That's about the only consolation I've had today." Lestrade was absent, but his head constable was ready to assist. They had spent the morning sifting through the ashes of the burned woodpile, uncovering what seemed to be a small treasure trove. Amid the charred remains, several discoloured metal discs caught my attention, buttons clearly. One even bore the mark of Hyams, Oldacre's tailor. Holmes methodically scanned the lawn for traces or signs. The drought had baked the earth to hardness, leaving nothing to show where the struggle might have taken place. Only a low privet hedge bore evidence that some body or bundle had been dragged through it, aligned perfectly with the woodpile. Everything, of course, fit the official theory. He crawled over the lawn under the blazing August sun, minute by minute, but after an hour he rose no wiser than before. "Then I turned my attention to the bedroom," he continued. "The bloodstains were faint, mere smears and discolorations, but undeniably fresh. The stick had been removed, though its marks remained subtle. There is no doubt it belonged to our client. He admits it. Footprints of both men were visible on the carpet, but none of a third party, which again favoured the other side. The police were accumulating their evidence, while we were at a standstill." Holmes's eyes flickered with the tiniest hint of hope. "Only one small glimmer, though it proved ultimately inconclusive. I examined the contents of the safe. Most papers had been removed and left on the table. They were bundled into sealed envelopes, a few of which the police had already opened. They seemed of little real value. Oldacre was far from wealthy, at least according to the bank book. Yet not all the documents were accounted for. References to certain deeds, possibly the most important ones, were missing." Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled, eyes narrowing with that familiar intensity. "This," he said, "if we could prove it beyond doubt, would completely turn Lestrade's argument on its head. Who steals something he knows he will soon inherit?" He paused, then continued, voice low but charged with conviction. "Having exhausted every lead without a clue, I turned my attention to the housekeeper, Mrs. Lexington, small, dark, silent, with suspicious sidelong eyes. I am convinced she knows more than she lets on, but she is as tight-lipped as wax. Yes, she let Macfarlane in at 9:30. She wished later that she had never done so. She went to bed at 10:30. Her room was at the opposite end of the house. She heard nothing of what followed. Macfarlane left his hat and, to the best of her knowledge, his stick in the hall. She was awakened by the alarm of the fire. Her poor master, she insists, had certainly been murdered. Did he have enemies? Well, most men do, but Oldacre kept to himself, met only in business matters. She noticed the buttons among the ashes and confirmed they belonged to his clothes. The woodpile burned like tinder. It had not rained for a month. By the time she reached it, all that remained was flame, and the smell of burnt flesh clung to the air. She knew nothing of the papers, nor of Oldacre's private affairs. Holmes's hands clenched, knuckles white, as if gripping the very threads of the mystery. "So, Watson, that is my report of a failure, and yet, his thin hands shook with conviction. "I know it is all wrong. I feel it in my bones. Something is hidden, and that housekeeper knows it." There was a sulky defiance in her eyes, a defiance that only comes with guilty knowledge. "But there is no point in talking further, Watson. Unless some fortunate chance presents itself, I fear that the Norwood disappearance case will not enter the chronicles of our successes, at least not yet. The patient public may have to wait a while longer to witness the truth."
Surely, I ventured, the man's appearance would sway any jury in his favor. Holmes shook his head, his fingers steepled, eyes sharp. A dangerous assumption, Watson. Remember that case in '87, Bert Stevens, the so-called murderer, who seemed the very picture of innocence, mild-mannered, Sunday school type, and yet, his eyes darkened, and yet he was capable of terrible things. Appearances can deceive. It is true, I admitted. Unless we can establish a credible alternative theory, this young man is doomed. Every investigation done so far has only strengthened the evidence against him. But there is one curious point among Oldacre's papers that may provide a foothold. The bank book shows the balance unusually low over the past year, primarily because of large checks made out to a Mr. Cornelius. Now, who is this Cornelius? A broker, perhaps, but no scrip accompanies these payments. Could he have played a role in the affair? Our next step must be to trace these transactions at the bank. But Watson, I fear that unless fortune favors us, the case will end ignobly, with Lestrade claiming a triumph for Scotland Yard and our client paying the price.
I could see the weight of the case pressing on him that night. When I came down to breakfast the next morning, Holmes looked pale and harried, his usually bright eyes gleaming even more sharply against the dark shadows beneath them. Cigarette butts littered the carpet, early editions of the morning papers lay scattered, and an open telegram rested on the table. "What do you make of this, Watson?" he asked, tossing it toward me. I read it. "Important fresh evidence to hand. McFarlane's guilt definitely established. Advise you to abandon case. Lestrade." Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. The words burned on the paper, but I could see already that his mind was turning, wheels spinning, plotting the next move. This was far from over. "This sounds serious," I said, glancing at the telegram. Holmes gave a bitter, almost sardonic smile. "It is Lestrade's little cockadoodle of victory," he said. "And yet it may be premature to abandon the case. Important, fresh evidence can cut both ways. Today, Watson, I feel that I shall need your company and your moral support." He ignored his own breakfast, one of his peculiar habits in moments of intense focus. I had seen him many times push his body past exhaustion, refusing food until fainting from sheer lack of sustenance. "At present," he would say when I remonstrated, "I cannot spare energy and nerve force for digestion." So it was no surprise when he left his untouched plate behind and set off with me for Norwood. A crowd of morbid sightseers still thronged the gates of Deep Dean House, craning their necks to see the villa, exactly the sort of suburban mansion I had pictured. Lestrade was waiting for us, his face flushed with triumph, every movement saturated with the smug satisfaction of a man who thinks the case won. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he called, striding toward us, "have you proved us wrong yet? Have you found your tramp?" Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "I have formed no conclusion whatsoever," he replied calmly. "But we formed ours yesterday," Lestrade shot back, "and it has proven correct. Surely you must admit, Mr. Holmes, that we are slightly ahead this time." Holmes's eyes twinkled with a quiet, dangerous amusement. "You certainly give the impression that something unusual has occurred," he said, his tone measured. Lestrade laughed loudly with all the overconfidence of a man convinced of victory. "Well, you don't like being beaten any more than the rest of us, do you, Dr. Watson? Step this way, gentlemen. I think I can finally convince you that John McFarlane is the criminal in this affair." Lestrade led us through the narrow passage into a dimly lit hall beyond. "This is where young McFarlane must have stepped out to fetch his hat after the incident," he said, his voice heavy with triumph. Then, with a sudden flourish, he struck a match. The tiny flame flickered across the whitewashed wall, revealing a dark stain. As the match drew closer, I realized it was more than just a smear. It was unmistakably the print of a thumb, pressed into the wall as if in haste or struggle. "Take a look with your magnifying glass, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade urged. Holmes leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, I am examining it." "You do realize," Lestrade continued, "that no two thumb marks are alike?" "I've heard something of the kind," Holmes replied evenly. "Well, then, compare this with the wax impression of Macfarlane's right thumb, taken this morning by my orders." Lestrade held the wax close to the stain, and even without a magnifying glass, it was chillingly clear. The two prints matched perfectly. The evidence seemed irrefutable. I felt a sinking certainty that our young client was doomed. "That is final," Lestrade said, almost with glee. "Yes, that is final," I echoed, my voice tight. "It is final," Holmes said, and something in the way he said it made me pause. I turned to him and almost fell back. His face was alight with a strange, almost cruel amusement. His eyes sparkled like twin stars, and his thin lips twitched as if he were trying desperately to restrain a laugh. Dear me," he murmured, voice trembling with suppressed mirth. "Well, who would have thought it? How deceptive appearances can be. Such a fine young man to look at, and yet a lesson, isn't it, Lestrade? Never trust your own judgment too quickly." Lestrade bristled, but could not deny the point. "Yes, some of us are a little too cocksure, Mr. Holmes," he admitted. Holmes's smile widened, a mix of triumph and quiet ridicule. In that moment, it was clear that the real game was just beginning, and that Lestrade's victory, so confidently declared, was about to unravel completely. Holmes's eyes glimmered as he spoke, though his tone was deceptively calm. "What extraordinary luck," he said, "that this young man should press his right thumb against the wall while taking his hat from the peg. Such a natural motion, yet it gives us a clue of immense importance." Even as he appeared composed, his body betrayed him. A subtle, restless quiver of excitement ran through his frame. "By the way, Lestrade, who was responsible for discovering this mark?" "The housekeeper, Mrs. Lexington. She drew the night constable's attention to it." "And where was the constable at the time?" "He was stationed in the bedroom where the crime took place to ensure nothing was disturbed," said Lestrade. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And why did the police not notice this yesterday?" "Well, the hole hadn't been examined closely," Lestrade admitted. "It's not in a particularly obvious place, as you can see." "No, of course not," Holmes murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And the mark, there's no doubt it was there yesterday?" Lestrade stared at him exasperated, as if Holmes had lost his mind. Even I was caught off guard by the mixture of hilarity and intensity in his expression. "I don't know whether you think Mr. Macfarlane went to such lengths as to leave incriminating evidence against himself," Lestrade said with a dry edge, "but any expert would recognize that it is indeed the mark of his thumb." "It is unquestionably his thumb," Holmes confirmed, his eyes twinkling with restrained amusement. "That's enough," Lestrade said bluntly. "I am a practical man. I rely on evidence to draw conclusions. If you have anything to add, you'll find me in the sitting room writing my report." Holmes's calm returned almost instantly, though I still caught occasional gleams of mischief in his face. "Dear me, Watson," he said softly, "this seems a most serious development, and yet there are subtle details here that give hope for our client." "I'm glad to hear it," I said, relief flooding me. I had feared it was all over for him. "I would hardly go so far as to say that, Watson," Holmes said, his eyes glinting. "There is a critical flaw in this piece of evidence, one that our friend Lestrade seems to attach far too much importance to." "Really, Holmes, "What flaw?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Simply this. I know that Mark was not there when I inspected the hall yesterday. And now, Watson," he added with a mischievous sparkle, "let us take a stroll in the sunlight." My thoughts were still tangled, but a spark of hope warmed my chest as I followed him. We walked slowly around the garden, Holmes scrutinizing every facade of the house with keen attention. Then he led me inside, moving methodically from basement to attic. The rooms were largely unfurnished, but he left none unchecked, examining every corner, every shadowed recess. Finally, on the top corridor, which ran past 3 empty bedrooms, he stopped abruptly, a suppressed laugh shaking his features. "Truly, Watson," he said, barely containing himself, "this case has some remarkable quirks. I believe it is time we brought our friend Lestrade into our confidence. He has smiled at our expense long enough, and perhaps now it is our turn to return the courtesy, if my understanding of this puzzle proves correct. Yes, I think I see our approach clearly." When we returned to the parlour, Lestrade was still hunched over his report. Holmes cut across the room with quiet authority. "I understood you were writing your conclusions on this case," he said. "I am," replied Lestrade, glancing up. "Don't you think it might be premature?" Holmes asked lightly. "I can't help feeling your evidence is incomplete." Lestrade looked at him, eyebrows raised, sensing that Holmes's words carried more than casual suggestion. "What do you mean, Holmes?" "There is one important witness you have not yet seen," Holmes said, his tone calm but electric with anticipation. "Can you produce this witness?" Lestrade asked, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity in his voice. "I believe I can," said Holmes. "Then do so," said the inspector, settling back with cautious expectation. "I will do my best. How many constables are at your disposal?" Holmes asked, his gaze sharp. "There are 3 within call," replied Lestrade. "Excellent," Holmes said. "May I ask if they are all large, able-bodied men with powerful voices?" Lestrade blinked. "I suppose they are, though I fail to see what that has to do with anything." "Perhaps I can help you see that, and 1 or 2 other things as well," Holmes said, with a faint secretive smile. "Kindly summon your men, and we shall proceed." 5 minutes later, 3 policemen had assembled in the hall, their boots thudding softly on the floor. "In the outhouse you will find a considerable quantity of straw," Holmes said. "I will ask you to carry in 2 bundles of it. It will, I think, be of the greatest assistance in producing the witness whom I require. Thank you." He turned to me. "Watson, you have matches in your pocket, I believe." "Yes, Holmes." "Very good. Now, Mr. Lestrade, I shall ask you and your men to accompany me to the top landing." We ascended to the broad corridor that ran outside the 3 empty bedrooms. Holmes positioned us carefully, the constables grinning with anticipation, and Lestrade's face a mixture of amazement, expectation, and barely suppressed derision. Holmes stood before us with the deliberate calm of a magician preparing his grand illusion. "Would you kindly send one of your constables for 2 buckets of water?" he said. "Place the straw on the floor here, away from the walls on either side. Now I believe we are ready." Lestrade's face flushed, a mixture of irritation and impatience. "I do not know whether you are playing a game with us, Mr. Holmes," he snapped. "If you know anything, you can surely say it without all this pomp and ceremony." "I assure you, my good Lestrade," said Holmes, his tone light yet commanding, "there is an excellent reason for everything I do. You may recall your little triumph some hours ago, when the sun seemed on your side of the hedge. Think of this as a small measure of payback. Watson, if you please, open the window and then apply a match to the edge of the straw." A thin curl of smoke rose, and the scent of burning straw began to fill the corridor. Every eye was fixed on Holmes, whose calm, unassuming demeanor only heightened the suspense. I did so, and the draught from the open window sent a coil of bray smoke curling down the corridor, while the dry straw crackled and flamed like a miniature inferno. "Now, we must see if we can summon this witness for you, Lestrade," said Holmes, his tone calm, almost teasing. "Might I ask you all to join in the cry of fire? On my count, 1, 2, 3. "Fire!" we all yelled, our voices echoing through the empty house. "Thank you. Once again, if you please. Fire! And one last time, all together. Fire!" The shout rang out over Norwood, startling the few early risers in the street, and then, as though the house itself had responded, an astonishing thing occurred. A door, seemingly solid and unnoticed before, suddenly swung open at the end of the corridor. Out darted a little wizened man, swift and southern, like a rabbit springing from its burrow. "Capital," said Holmes, with his usual serene precision. "Watson, a bucket of water over the straw. Thank you. That will do. Lestrade, allow me to present your principal missing witness, Mr. Jonas Oldacre." The detective stared, dumbfounded, at the newcomer. Oldacre blinked rapidly in the bright light, his gaze flitting from us to the smoldering straw. His face was odious, crafty, vicious, malignant, with shifty light gray eyes framed by white lashes. Every movement betrayed a cunning survival instinct. "What's this, then?" Lestrade finally managed, his voice a mixture of outrage and impatience. "What have you been doing all this time, eh?" Oldacre gave a nervy, uneasy laugh and shrank back from the fiery glare of the furious inspector. "I have done no harm," he said, his tone almost plaintive. "No harm?" Lestrade bellowed, taking a step forward. "You have done your best to get an innocent man hanged. Were it not for this gentleman here," he jabbed a finger at Holmes, "I am not sure that you would not have succeeded." The wretched little man began to whimper, his voice trembling. I am sure, sir, it was only my practical joke," he whimpered, his cunning eyes now edged with panic. Holmes, however, stood perfectly still, his calm demeanor unshaken, the smallest shadow of a smile playing on his lips. The entire theater of deception, smoke, fire, and fear had culminated in this one moment, proof that appearances could be frightfully deceptive.
Holmes's eyes sparkled with quiet triumph as he motioned for us to step closer. "Elementary, my dear Lestrade," he said, in that leisurely tone which always suggested that he was thinking several moves ahead. "Observe the layout of the house. The corridor along the top floor was unusually wide, and the wall at the end, well, there is no reason for it to have contained nothing but a wall. The air currents, the shadows, the unusual silence in that part of the house, all pointed to some hollow space behind it. Then there was the behavior of the housekeeper, Mrs. Lexington, her sulky, defiant manner, the slight hesitation when questioned about the night in question. These were not the signs of ignorance, but of concealment. From these trifles I inferred the existence of a secret hiding-place." Lestrade shook his head, his face a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "You mean to say you saw all that in a few hours and pieced it together like a child with a puzzle?" Holmes interrupted gently, smiling. "There is also another hint. The fireplace on that landing has no chimney, and a casual observer might have passed it by, but a clever man, observing light through the eaves, might suspect that it served some other purpose. All I had to do was rattle the straw and create a small panic. Then, like a cornered rat, Oldacre revealed himself. I looked into the cramped little chamber.
Oldacre's books, his meager supplies of food, and a small kettle for water made it clear he had planned to remain invisible for some time. Yet, despite his cunning, the trap had been laid so subtly that it required the mind of Holmes to perceive it. And the will, the supposed crime, the blood, the thumb mark? Lestrade asked, still trying to absorb the sequence. Artful theatrics, Holmes said. Oldacre knew that by staging the scene of a murder and a disappearing body, he could test the character of his heir and have a little fun at the same time. The thumb mark entirely contrived, for he knew that a slight smear of blood on a convenient wall would lend credence to his fiction. The fire, the charred buttons, even the missing stick, all carefully planned diversions. You see, Lestrade, nothing is so deceptive as a well-laid hoax by a clever man. Lestrade ran a hand over his flushed face. I confess, Mr. Holmes, I'm thoroughly beaten. You've not only saved the young man's life, but outwitted me entirely. Holmes's eyes twinkled. And yet, my dear friend, all is well that ends well. Macfarlane is free, Oldacre has had his jest, and Scotland Yard emerges with honor, so long as one interprets the term loosely. Now, Watson, I suggest we fetch our young client and explain that fortune and justice both smile upon him. The detective's voice carried that rare note of satisfaction, the sort that only comes when a seemingly impossible puzzle has been solved with elegance, wit, and precision. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that rare combination of mischief and intellect that I had learned to watch for. The object, my dear Lestrade, is twofold. First, a practical jest on the young man who would inherit his fortune, a little test of character, as it were. Second, to assure that John Macfarlane would not be swayed by impatience, fear, or the prospect of immediate wealth. Oldacre is a man who delights in exercising his wit, and, more than that, he wishes to see that the true heir is of the right metal before he comes fully into his inheritance. By fabricating the appearance of murder, of theft, even of evidence like the thumb mark, he ensures that Macfarlane's patience and honesty are fully tested. Lestrade shook his head, still gaping, but with growing admiration. I must say, Mr. Holmes, that if ever I encountered a criminal mind worthy of you, it was certainly not in Macfarlane. And yet, this Oldacre I could never have guessed.
Holmes waved a hand with serene finality. Precisely. Observe, Lestrade, how the world is deceived by appearances. Macfarlane is young, innocent, and frightened. The thumb mark, the charred buttons, the disappearance of the body, all these trivialities led you to a conclusion which seemed inevitable. Yet the truth, simple and elegant, lay in one cunning man's desire to amuse himself and simultaneously test the integrity of another. Lestrade rubbed his forehead. And the papers, the bank book, the will? All perfectly legitimate, said Holmes. No theft, no crime, merely a staged scenario. You see, in this way, Oldacre not only preserves the illusion of danger, but also provides a thrilling story for posterity, while ensuring that Macfarlane's character is proven. In short, we were chasing shadows, while the real drama was entirely psychological. And the housekeeper? Lestrade asked with a trace of hesitancy. She is complicit, to be sure, but not as an accomplice in crime, rather as an obedient assistant in Oldacre's little theatrical design. The trick of the hidden room, the careful concealment of his presence, and the timing of the thumb mark all required a second pair of hands, attentive and discreet. Without her, the plan would have faltered. Lestrade sank into a chair, speechless. By Jove, you've turned what seemed a ghastly crime into a masterstroke of harmless deception. Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile. And the moral, Lestrade, is simple. Never be too certain that your first glance at a situation reveals the truth.
Often it is the least suspected detail, here a wax seal, a thumb, a hidden corridor, that overturns all expectation. I watched Lestrade absorb the lesson, a mixture of humility and awe upon his features, while Holmes allowed himself a small, satisfied chuckle. The game, as always, had been won with elegance, subtlety, and that remarkable eye for human character which made him, beyond doubt, the most formidable detective in London. Lestrade, still pale with astonishment and awe, followed Holmes and me down the stairs in silence. The detective's usual swagger had entirely vanished, replaced by a kind of reverent curiosity. We entered the sitting-room where Jonas Oldacre, the architect of this elaborate deception, sat with a mixture of defiance and unease. Holmes's gaze, keen and unblinking, fell upon him. "Mr. Oldacre," he began, his tone deliberate and calm, "you have displayed remarkable ingenuity, but I am curious, why take such extraordinary pains to frighten an innocent young man and to confound the police?" Oldacre shifted uncomfortably in his chair, wringing his hands. I wanted to see if he was worthy. I meant no real harm. It was only a test of his character, and perhaps a little amusement for myself. You cannot think I would have allowed an innocent man to suffer truly." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Ah, but you see, in matters of justice, the appearance of guilt is sufficient to cause panic, distress, and moral trial. Your design was nearly perfect, but it failed at the last, because, like all clever men who overreach, you drew attention to yourself. The thumb mark, the carefully hidden room, the controlled chaos, all intended to frame a scenario of crime, yet your own theatrical instincts betrayed the deception." Oldacre's face fell. "Then he is safe?" "Entirely," said Holmes, nodding toward Macfarlane, who stood quietly by Lestrade's side. "And more, he has passed your test admirably, maintaining patience, honesty, and courage under pressure. The net you wove was intricate, but one cannot tangle a spider without risking a few strands snapping back." Lestrade, still digesting the revelation, muttered, "By Jove, I thought the case was airtight, yet here we are, innocent man cleared, culprit in plain sight, and me made a fool of in the process."
Holmes smiled faintly. "Not a fool, Inspector. Consider it a lesson in humility and attention to the subtle signs which, when interpreted correctly, reveal the true design beneath appearances. And now, Mr. Oldacre, I trust you will take care that no similar alarm or fright falls upon another innocent party." Oldacre lowered his gaze, sheepish but relieved. "Yes, I believe I have learned that lesson, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned to us with his usual mixture of calm authority and private satisfaction. "And that, my dear Watson, concludes what might have been a tragedy, but is instead a triumph of observation, reasoning, and patience." I could only marvel, as always, at the ease with which he had untangled a web that would have ensnared the most careful minds in London. And as Oldacre's crafty eyes followed Holmes' departing figure, I knew that we had witnessed yet another demonstration of the remarkable power of his singular intellect. Oldacre's face turned a peculiar shade of green as he realized that every trick, every carefully laid deception had been seen through. Holmes, with a quiet chuckle, continued, "Really, the ingenuity of your practical joke was remarkable, Mr. Oldacre. A man of your talents might have caused a scandal of the first magnitude, yet all it took was a little careful observation and a mind accustomed to tracing motives and minutiae to reveal the truth." Lestrade, still trying to recover his composure, muttered, "You certainly have a way of making a fool of us all, Mr. Holmes.
I must admit I never suspected this little devil would have hidden himself in his own house just to observe the panic he'd create. Oldacre, wringing his hands, whispered, I didn't mean to frighten anyone, really. It was just so fascinating to watch. And MacFarlane, I assure you I never meant him harm." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "The lesson here is that even the most intricate plans unravel when human nature is involved. Fear, cunning, and pride will always leave a trail. Your scheme depended upon MacFarlane's guilt, yet he was blameless. You relied upon appearances, but appearances are as fleeting as shadows. And now, as you sit here, you will have plenty of opportunity to consider the consequences of your curiosity and malice." I shall do nothing more of the sort, sir, I swear it," Oldacre stammered, almost pleadingly. Holmes gave a mild bow. "See that you do, Mr. Oldacre. Meanwhile, Inspector Lestrade, I believe your report may now reflect the true state of affairs. An innocent man saved, a malignant schemer in custody, and a criminal design undone by its own audacity." Lestrade shook his head, half in admiration, half in frustration, while MacFarlane, now relieved beyond words, breathed freely for the first time in many anxious hours. And as Holmes turned to leave, his smile quiet but triumphant, I knew yet again that he had transformed a potential tragedy into a masterful display of deduction and justice. Holmes glanced back at Oldacre, who sat subdued and powerless. "And as for the woodpile," he said with a faint hint of amusement, "rabbits, dogs, or old trousers, they may serve as you wish, Mr. Watson, but never again as instruments of terror." The little man's eyes lowered, and a silence fell over the room, broken only by the shuffling of constables preparing to lead him away. It was the end of one of the most cunning and curious schemes I had ever witnessed, and yes, the justice of it all left a satisfaction that no courtly sentence could provide.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.